feature of housing also means where the housing is located. So I will talk about the quality, the city quality, and I will talk about how to make livable cities in the 21st century, and we'll start right here. We have a great problem. For the past 50 years, we have done all we could to chase the people out of our cities. Before the modernism, before the Second World War, most cities all over the world, including in Cyprus and in Greece, they looked exactly like this. They were made by people, for people, they were on human scale, and they were based on the human ways of moving and the human senses. We all felt very comfortable in this scale of city, in this scale of habitation. Then came two enormous earthquakes for housing and city planning. I think that it started really to be bad around 1960. And one was the modernism. Of course, the ideas of modernism was generated in the 20s and 30s, but they were not much used during the war and the first years after. Then it really took on, and it started to fill the whole horizon with new type of housing based for what the modernists called a new type of species. Homo sapiens were not anymore. Now we have the modern man, and he should live completely different from anything before. Great earthquake, great transformation. The other big things happening at that time was a car invasion. Before the modernism, it's interesting to realize that all the cities, all the human habitations, they were not consisting of buildings, but of spaces where the life of the city could go on, where people could walk from one place to another, where the market could be, where the possessions could be, where the important civic events could happen, all spaces. With the modernists, the focus was moved completely away from the spaces to the objects. Instead of spaces, it was now the buildings which were in center, and whatever was not built upon was not spaces for people, but leftover space. If we think of the old cities we know, we can always remember a number of good spaces. We can remember the streets, the squares, the parks, and maybe also we can remember a few important buildings like the cathedral, the parliament, the courthouse, the king's castle, whatever. We can remember these few buildings. All the other buildings are anonymous, and the spaces is a basic thing of cities. In the new cities, all we can remember is a number of funny buildings, and we can never, most often we cannot remember any spaces at all, because spaces, creating spaces, were never really in the foreground of the intention when making new cities. Also, we started now to have city planning, which you can order on the internet, and you can have what I call the bird shit architects come flying in from all directions and put down funny towers wherever they are ordered to put them down. Completely new situation and completely changed for mankind and his urban setting. The result of all this was certainly a goodbye to concern for people in the public spaces, people in the outdoors. All the modernistic spaces all over the world, they are generally completely unusable for people. They are boring, they are endless paths, they are not at all worth moving in 5 kilometers an hour. Another effect of the modernism was a goodbye to human scale. Suddenly we could build enormous big spaces, enormous big houses, and we scaled up everything and people was left in the voids, in the leftover space between all these enormous structures. There was a great difference from the old human scale, which the human settlements were based on in the earlier days. The other thing which happened in the last 50 years in this same period, as the modernism started to be very influential, that was the invasion of the motor car. That took place all over the world, started at various times, but in all the places now it's gone very serious. And again, we found that the people were chased completely out of the urban environments. It's very bad in nearly all cities in the Western world. It's really bad in many cities. Here it is Romania. It's not too good, and we can see that people are treated badly from one end of the world to the other. There's no respect for people. There's a lot of concern and attention to the traffic and the parking, but how people can fare in these cities has stopped to be an issue in many places. What other things which happened with this was further goodbye to human scale. With the modernism, we got entirely confused about scale. We forgot about human scale, and we could not handle scale. But it got even worse with the invasion by the motor car. In the old cities, we had what I call 5 km/h architecture. The spaces are small. You move among people. You can see the small signal, the little signs on the wall, and you can have the best of two worlds. You can see the buildings close by, see all the details, and you can see the mountains in the distance. With the introduction of the motor car, everything was blown up, and you started to make all the spaces so that they were good for 60 km/h. And we have the 60 km/h architecture where all the spaces are huge, all the signs are enormous, or you cannot see them. There are no details on the buildings because you cannot enjoy them anyway. There are no people, or at least you cannot see any people in this scale. This is actually, by now, the scale of the suburbs. It's a scale of the American burger strip. And this kind of scale has started to dominate urban landscapes all over the world. It's completely inhuman if you think about what good human scale was. I think it's high time to counter these movements and win back the cities for people, and there will be many advantages in this time. But first we can start to ask the question, what was known about quality for people in 1960? And the answer here is next to nothing. But then in 1961, we started to see the first counter movements to the modernism and the motorism. That was the voice from New York, from Greenwich Village, by the architectural journalist Jane Jacobs, who was sitting in Greenwich Village, which the planners in New York, Robert Moses and company, they wanted to erase Manhattan for all the redundant old stuff. Greenwich Village, Tribeca, Soho, Little Italy, Chinatown, all these old-fashioned, redundant habitations should go and leave room for some smart new freeways across Manhattan and high-rise from one side to the other. That should be a much better New York. Jane Jacobs fought this with the other citizens vigorously. They won. It never came about this way. Greenwich Village was saved and is, as you know by now, one of the nicest areas in Manhattan today. She put down what she learned in this fight in the book, Death and Life of Great American Cities. That was a very, very important book. It's sort of the Bible of humanistic city planning, and Jane Jacobs has the status of a guru of something. She's the godmother of humanistic city planning. I'm one of the disciples. I didn't know about Jane Jacobs when I started working in the 60s. but I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I graduated 1960, meaning that by now I've been an active full-time architect for 60 years. I was trained in the 50s, and what did we learn in the 50s? We learned to move objects around, and we learned to organize cities as compositions of objects. We were told we should always hang over the model. We should hang in 5-kilometer heights and put down the models, the objects, until a nice pattern had developed. And we were told that a new housing area was something which looked great from the aeroplane and great for the freeway. Nobody talked about the city at eye level. Nobody talked about whether people would be more happy to live in something which looked great from an aeroplane. I was taught all this, and I went out of School of Architecture in 1960 to practice all these wonderful modernistic stuff, which will make people hilariously happy all over the world. And then I married a psychologist, and then suddenly we had other discussions. Young architects and young sociologists and psychologists met in our house, and all the time we discussed what is good housing, good cities for people, and all the time the social science people, they bigger than us architects, saying, why are you architects not really interested in people? Why don't they teach you anything about people in School of Architecture? Why do you think your professors go out 4 o'clock in the morning to photograph the monument so they're sure there are no disturbing people in the foreground on the pictures when they show them later in the day at the lectures? Have you guys thought about this? And of course, we must humbly say, as young architects at that time, no, we had not learned about this. We never thought about this. We were told that whatever you do, you manipulate grossly with the quality of life for people, but you don't know a thing about what you're doing. This was hard stuff for a young architect. And in my case, I had to go back to School of Architecture and study 40 more years. Actually, I went back, of course, to hear what they forgot to tell me first time I was in School of Architecture, just to find out that I was told nothing, because at that time, nothing was known about how architecture influenced quality of life and people's behavior, how people interacted with the buildings. Nothing was known about that at that time. So we had to start really from the bottom. And the thing really was to make people visible so that we could start to discuss how they used our buildings and our cities. And in my case, I just sat there observing, watching for 40 years all over the world, in all climates, morning and night, rain and sun and snow, Greenland and South Africa, South America, Japan, everywhere. We tried it all, and gradually we started to see a number of knowledge about how people used their environments. After a while, I was able to put together some of these observations, some of these examples in my first book, my thesis called Life Between Buildings. It came out now for exactly 50 years ago. And gradually it started to be spread over the world. And when it was spread so widely, I realized, because there was no literature about people in the city at that time, there was no knowledge, and everybody had started to be tired of modernism and motorism and wanted to have information about what to do. In 2010, that is about 40 years after the first book, I was asked to put everything I have collected in my 40 years of research in one volume. And that was the book, Cities for People, which is supposed to know, to have the truth, the full truth, and nothing but the truth. Much to my joy, it has now, in just 10 years, been spread all over the world. It may be not be that it's a fantastic book, but it's one of the few books about human considerations in relations to city planning. And all over the world, there is a great hunger for this kind of information. That can explain why this book was spread so widely in such a short little while. Now there's been done research in this area ever since James Jacobs started in 61. And we have 50 years of research, actually now 60 years of research. And if you ask me, I would say we know pretty well now how to make fine cities for people. The problem really is to apply this knowledge to the cities. What really we have found in all this research is that we have an enormous influence through our buildings and our city plans to the quality of life for people, to the way they live. And it can be summed up in this way, that first we form the cities, but then by God, the cities form us. We have enormous influence and we must know about what we are doing because we manipulate all the time. While all this research was going on and these paradigms of modernism and motorism was really being used all over the world, it's now 15 years, they started really 60 years, and now we really have a set of new goals in city planning. Everybody now wants a lively, livable city. They want a sustainable city. They want a healthy city. And they realize it's increasingly important that we make cities which are good to be old in. The first thing about cities which are livable and lively, that has to do about the human dimension, that has to do about the century-old notion of people meeting other people, of the city being a meeting place for people, that we come together in the city to meet each other and together develop our human culture. The urban space and the urban life has always been an essential part of city life, and it still is very important. We can realize now in the pandemic time how much we miss the lively city, how much we miss to meet other people directly, and how glad we are with life around us, and how glad we are for going out in public spaces where you can see the society you're living in, where you can see your neighbors, when you can see the small things of life. The greatest attraction for Homo sapiens has always been people. Homo sapiens is indeed a social animal. And the attraction number one throughout our life is other people. And certainly also in cities, other people is a much higher attraction than any funny building you can make. You can see this attraction to lively sceneries. Whenever an architect today hand in a project, it's swarming with happy people doing funny things. That is put on, we call it people washing. Every time you have a project, you people wash it. So it's crawling with people, and that signalizes, this is a good place. I would like to be here. It must be a good place. If it wasn't a good place, these people would not be there. They will run out of the space. They will go home as fast as possible. So people in a scenery is a sign of quality, and we love it. The next really serious challenge today is that we have to make a much more sustainable cities than we used to. We have to, the challenge from climate change is enormous, and we have a short span of years to change our ways. Of course, we have to look closely into mobility and realize that we cannot go on using gasoline and diesel, whatever. We'll have to use renewable energy, and we cannot also continue to use all these resources for making all these silly cars, which are standing quiet, idle 95% of their total life. So building cars for individual use is a fantastic waste of resources because they hardly work anything. We must see in the future there will be many more shared cars. There will be much more public transportation. It will have much better quality as we go along. And it's very important that we have fantastic environments for walking and bicycling so that they can link up with the public transportation. And of course, if people walk more and bicycle more, that's of course also better for the climate. So we have a major motivation here to make better cities for people. Also from the doctors, we hear new songs now. They are talking all the time about the sitting syndrome. They say for 50 years, you architects and planners have made cities where everything is done to invite people to sit as much as possible. Now people are dying of sitting too much. If everybody do 1 hour of moderate exercise every day, they can live 7 years longer. The quality of life in the old days will be so much better, and it will be much, much cheaper for society if people move more and sit less. So all the doctors say, make cities so that you move using your own muscles as much as possible. So end are the days where we should have escalators which goes up to the fitness center. Now they say, make it the cities so that you have built-in invitation that is the natural thing to do, that you do as much as possible walking and bicycling in your city. Also by now, we have in the western part of the developed part of the world, we have more and more elderly people. Actually, we have elderly people in all societies. And we have increasingly the challenge to make our cities so that they are good for the elderly people. And of course, we realize that if we make cities which are good for people, they are also very much better for the elderly. Actually, they are good in the winter, they are good in the summer, they are good for the children, and they are good for the elderly. So make cities for people. What we know about the elderly people, I know it because I'm in that group, that what the doctors say to us is 10,000 steps every day, we keep the doctor away. Just get out there and walk, old fellows and old girls. That is a very good cure to keep alert and keep vital. But then the question comes, what kind of environment are offered to walk these 10,000 steps in here and there and there? Very different conditions. If we sum up all this, if we look carefully after people in city planning, it will efficiently address all the issues. You will have a more livable, a more sustainable, a more healthy city, and a city which is much better to be old in. It is a win-win situation. Then we can ask, are there cities saying in this city everything will be done to invite people to walk and to bicycle as much as possible in the course of their daily day doings? And by daily day doings is meant that it's not what you do for the weekends and for the holidays. No, it's what you do for the Mondays and Tuesdays. We're talking about daily day doings. And it's the daily day we shall do this 1 hour of moderate exercise. Every day it should be inviting and easy to do. Are there cities doing this now? Yeah, actually all over the world you can see cities are increasingly starting to take on this agenda and take the people in the city planning seriously. I will now invite you to a number of the cities where I have worked in the past years with my company of Gehl Architects. And of course, I can tell you a lot of details, which I will not have time for today. I could start to tell about Melbourne. It was an awful American type office city in 1985. They decided in Melbourne to revitalize the city. They have done enormously much to revitalize the city. They have put out many of the cars in the city center. They widened all the sidewalks. They put granite on all the sidewalks. They put trees all over the city. They made public transportation free in the city center. They've done a lot to make it much more inviting for people. They've also made many more residences in the city center. They've stepped up the population in the city center by 10 and 20 times since 2095. An impressive revitalization work. Also, I could invite you to Sydney, where we worked since 2006. Again, an impressive work has been done in Sydney, and it has been difficult because the waterfront in Sydney is wonderful, but the inner streets, city streets, they are full of cars and noise and buses and pollution, and there hardly any room for people to move in the city center of Sydney. That was the situation in 2006, but that is changing fast now, where they are taking out the cars, taking out the buses, making pedestrian spaces, and introducing light rail instead of all this fossil fuel transportation. A completely different cities. They do all this to be sustainable, to make Sydney green. And of course, like Melbourne, they also introduce citywide bicycle networks. To tell you about our work in New York, again, I told about these other cities at a conference, and then we worked in London, and then London to New York, and then we were invited to come and be advisors to New York, and with the mayor, Michael Bloomberg, who wanted to make New York the most sustainable metropole in the world. Great things were done. A citywide bicycle system was introduced, and also a number of public spaces were defined, were recreated. We found out that Broadway was not needed for the traffic, then actually you could close Broadway in all the important squares down the center of Manhattan. So Times Square was closed, Herald Square, Madison Square, Union Square, all these places, Broadway was closed and turned from a traffic hell into a place for people, which was immediately put into use. But other cities are doing it also. These ideas are spreading fast. Here, the mayor of Vilnius is going around showing people, don't park in my bike lanes. In Bucharest, it was not so good, but now they have my book in Romanian, and very shortly they will sort this out, I'm sure. I hope. Then in 2012, I was invited with my team to work in Moscow. The vice mayor of Moscow, he came to me at a conference and said, hey, we need very much to humanize Moscow. Can't we get started right away? So we went to Moscow, and we were absolutely shocked because Moscow at that time, 2012, was completely overrun by motor cars. And also there were hardly any rules for the motor cars. They could go anywhere, they could park anywhere. No parking fee, no parking places, no parking system. You park in the parks, on the boulevards, on the sidewalks, on the monuments, on the stairs. You do whatever you can, and they did. And the result was that the life in Moscow was almost completely erased. There were hardly any room for people anymore in Moscow. Here's a little side street, not much fun here. And here's the main street of Moscow, Tverskaya, where of course they also on this sidewalk had parking, and then left for the Moscovites to walk on their main street. 14 million people in the city. They had 1 meter of sidewalk left where they could squeeze through on the main street. The first thing they did in Moscow was they picked up my books and said, "Oh, there, you made some books here. We translate them into Russian right away." They took 3 of the books and they translated them right away. And 3 months later, they were published, all of them with the seal of Moscow in the corner and the minister from Moscow in the middle. Then we were commissioned to assist Moscow with a plan how to humanize the city and make it a greater city, a better city for people, which we did starting in July 2013. And now started a fantastic process of humanizing Moscow. This is sidewalk of Moscow, Main Street, Moscow, Tverskaya. In the old days, hardly any space for people. It was a gray street. Now it is a green street. It was full of cars. Now it's full of benches. The sky was full of advertisements. Now the sky is open, so you can see Kremlin. The side streets to the main street also had very poor conditions, but again, they were addressed. And instead of walking between the parked cars and whatever, now there's proper walking facilities. This little square, Pushkin Square, along the main street. Over the years, a lot of stuff has moved in here. Now, 5 years later, it's been cleaned up. You can find the metro station. Trees have come in. Sidewalk cafes popping up. The granite has been used for the pavement. One by one, the problems of Moscow has been addressed. They've also taken out the cars from the parks and the boulevards. They put up swings, they put up benches. And when I was over there last time, I think it was 2017, they came to me and said, "Hey, Jan, you know, you have created a new problem for us. We now have a Moscow baby boom, and we blame it on humanistic city planning because now the people can meet and they can kiss in the evenings and whatever, and we have baby boom." Actually, I'm quite proud if I could help to have a baby boom in Moscow, because now the citizens of Moscow, they have a much better city to use for meeting each other and having a rich life. I'll end this story by taking you to my hometown of Copenhagen. In Copenhagen, they've been one of the pioneers to do all these people planning, and they worked on it for 58 years, almost 60 years by now. Already in 1962, they took out the traffic from the main street of Copenhagen. And there was much discussion why you could do that. All the shops would die and people were not used to walking and it will never work. We were Danes, we were not Greeks. We were not accustomed to public life. We were not accustomed to promenading, and the climate was too bad. They took out the cars. Next year, we were Greeks, or starting to be Greeks, and we become much more Greek in our behavior every year since. If you want to realize when this was very early, it was the same time when Jane Jacobs over in New York was actually writing her book. She was writing, but in Copenhagen, they were removing the cars right away. They didn't know about Jane Jacobs, but both reacted on the same pressures. Copenhagen looked like every other European city by that time. All the squares were full of parking, but all these squares have now gradually been cleared of parking and given over now to people activities. All the waterfronts were used for parking cars. All the waterfronts are now freed of cars, and they are used for people and recreation. What is very important to understand why Copenhagen has done so much and has continued to do it for 60 years, that is the fact that Copenhagen was the first city in the world where was documented the life in the city. we in the university started to study city life. We used Copenhagen as our laboratorium. We followed what was happening in Copenhagen. We published one book after the other, after the third, mostly about Copenhagen. And the city planners and the mayors and the politicians and the citizens, they started to take a close interest in the life in the city. Very shortly, we knew as much about life in the city as the traffic engineers knew about traffic in the city. And then, of course, the politicians had a choice. Would you make a better city for cars or a better city for public life? We have the saying that what you count, you care for. As long as you do not know enough about life in the city, then you'll see that it's the traffic engineers who are the dominating ones and who will make the decisions about the future of the city. But if you start to have knowledge about the life in the city, then you can start to have a more balanced situation. Then you can make a much better city for people, which is what they have done. Here's the situation 1962. One street, 1 kilometer long, freed of traffic. This is the situation now, 2020, with many, many streets, squares, parks, boulevards, waterfronts given over to people activities. There are so many now that it's rather difficult to be a car here in this city. Also, an important thing in Copenhagen are the strategies and the visions. They have these visions. Where would we like Copenhagen to be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now? And they have made this decision: we will be the best city in the world for people. And then they made strategies how we can get there, where we should be 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now to reach this goal of being the best in the world for people. Again, this emphasizes that it's not a matter of making a smart inner city for the tourists and the shoppers. The city for people should be the entire city. And here are some examples. All the streets in Copenhagen were like the upper ones, asphalt from side to side. Now all of them have been transformed. They have only 2 lanes for cars, a good lane for resting, a good median. There are street trees, there are bicycle lanes, there are sidewalks, and the lower street is much more beautiful. It is much more safe for all categories. And it can take, lo and behold, it can take the same number of cars as the other street could, because now the traffic engineers are much smarter to organize the traffic. Another thing which is part of this new program of making Copenhagen people-friendly from one end to the other is the idea of the continuous sidewalks and bicycle lanes. Now, you don't have to stop when you are in a wheelchair or when you're with a baby carriage or when you're on a bicycle. You don't have to stop every time a little street goes out into another street. The sidewalk continues. And that means that my granddaughter, 7 years old, she has now been able to walk to school all the way herself because she can stay on the sidewalk from her door to the door of the school. Also part of this general policy of people-friendliness in Copenhagen is what they've done for the bicycles. They have actually very early decided that they will invite people to bicycle as much as possible and not let the cars take over all the space. And by now there is a complete citywide network of really good bicycle lanes. They have a curb to the traffic and a curb to the pedestrians, and it's for all generations, and it's very, very safe to bicycle. Also, this system means that they have now an alternative transportation system, which is used widely. We have something to do. Instead of going by car, we can do by other things. If you want a good alternative system, then you integrate it with the other transportation system. And here the trains take the bikes for free. Also, they have the policy, it should always be quicker to go by bicycle than to go by car. So they put in a number of shortcuts and bridges and whatever all over the city. Also, they have this strategy: we will be the best city in the world for bicycling. In conclusion, an impressive culture of using bicycle has gradually evolved. Now, 49% of all who commute to city to work and to study, they arrive on bicycles. 10 years ago, it was 38%. And what have we learned here? We learn in Copenhagen and the other cities that what you get what you invite for. If you invite for more people to walk, more public life and more bicycling, that is exactly what you get. If you invite by making more streets for more traffic, you get more traffic, but you have a choice. You can invite more people, invite to be a city for people. So in conclusion, the benefits of having a people priority in the city is obvious. It is much simpler and much cheaper than anything else you can do for city quality. And it creates a better city for all generations, everyone, rich and poor. And it is a policy which cities in all parts of the world can use right away. And this kind of policy you can start tomorrow. You don't have to wait for automatic car or smart city or nothing. You can start tomorrow. Some cities have been at it for 60 years. How can we do this? Yeah, I have 2 books in Greek, and that you can start by reading them. That will give you a good head start. I wish you a Merry Christmas. Thank you very much.